Welcome back to Vendée Radio. It is the 7th of May, the feast of Saint Stanislaus, Bishop and Martyr, in the year of our Lord 2024. I'm delighted today to be joined by Carlos Perona Calvete. He's a writer for the European Conservative, and he has a background in international relations and organizational behavior. He's worked in the field of European project management and is the author of recently published work, Metapolitics, City of God, Cities of Men, published by Angelico Press, in which he explores the metaphysics of political representation. Mr. Calvete, welcome to Vendée Radio.
Thanks for having me. Great to be here.
Mr. Perona Calvete, you authored two highly interesting essays in the European Conservative, which I would recommend to all of our listeners. The first was Conservatism and the Commons, and the second was That Rapacious Whig Against Edmund Burke's Theory of Economics and Ownership. Now, on Vendée Radio, we have been discussing some of the core institutions of the Christian social order. So we've discussed the institution of guilds, crusades, these foundational elements of Christendom. And I'd like to discuss the commons. This is something that isn't so appreciated within the Christian political and social order. So I'd first of all like to put it to you that what gets called the Great Reset by conservatives, maybe it's not so prominent in the public discourse now as it was a couple of years ago, but in a way, the Great Reset has already happened. There's a British author called Simon Fairley who wrote that, quote, over the course of a few hundred years, much of Britain's land has been privatized. That is to say, taken out of some form of collective ownership and management and handed over to individuals. Currently, in our property-owning democracy, nearly half the country is owned by 40,000 land millionaires, or 0.06% of the population, while most of the rest of us spend half our working lives paying off the debt on a patch of land barely large enough to accommodate a dwelling and a washing line. End quote. So it wasn't always this way. There was a third category of property. We're used to thinking of public property, which is really state property, and then private property, which Simon Fairley refers to here. So perhaps you could first of all outline for us, Mr. Perona, the legal status of common property. What was the commons?
Well, the commons, and I think the dialectic you established there and the commons kind of interrupting modern dichotomies is exactly right. The commons would be village level or community level or family level property, often not legally defined in any particular way, which is why the enclosures could get going even in the 12th century, even in the 13th century. We have examples of that going on. But most of the time when that happened, because there was no deed of property, there was no actual title of property, the monarch would take the side of the peasant, because oftentimes this was sort of aristocratic or land-owning segment strata of society trying to strengthen themselves. So it was perceived as a threat very often. So the monarch typically, at least from my understanding also in British history, was defensive of the peasant, of the rural classes, of the popular classes, not always serfs. We have this idea that the Middle Ages is serfdom and sort of despotic landed gentry. It's not really the case. If we go into the history of the commons, as Christians, we have a very clear antecedent, which is in the Bible. We have Numbers and Leviticus. They define the commons. They actually define the commons very, very clearly. Plato, to some degree in the Laws, defines the commons as well, talks about how if a people is spiritually more elevated, it will tend to farm in common, own land in common. But the Greek isn't ready for that, so he doesn't propose that for the Greeks, but still, officially at least, the land should belong to the city as such. Now, is that state property? Probably. I think the nuances that Plato is getting at really only flower in medieval Christendom, but there's something there. In the Bible, what you find, and I don't know if we want to go into the biblical view of the commons, but I think it probably informed our ancestors on this point. What you find in Numbers 26 is that every tribe of Israel, as they come in from Egypt, Moses is told, it's going to be Joshua who actually does this, but Moses is told to assign land based on the population of each tribe. So the tribes will get land, the families will get land, and then that's sort of it as far as the partition of land goes. I wonder sometimes whether that echoes Genesis 10 and the partition of land to the sons and the grandsons of Noah, and the division of nations, because the coming about of nations is providential. It's not Babel. It's prior to Babel. There's this kind of discourse that human diversity is always bad. Nations are always bad. No, this was actually the providential order. So you divide up the land based on the population of tribes, and there is tribal land from the beginning there in Numbers. In Leviticus 25, you get something else, which is that there's a ban on permanent selling of tribal or family land. The land that your family owns is yours forever. You can rent it out because you need the money, but it always reverts back to you at the end in the year of Jubilee, which I think is every 7 years or 9 years. I don't remember. But that's how Israelite Old Testament law is structured. I think that's really important because it means the land that is owned by a tribe and by a family is constitutive to them. It's the body. You can't lose it because that would be to lose a piece of the tribe. Sort of the ultimate punishment in the Old Testament is exile from the land. That's, I think, why. I think it's considered the human being, and you get this with some saints. They really have this vision. The human being goes all the way down. The animal is included in the extended human corporate persona, right? And the land is included there as well. You can't lose it. So by the time you get in the New Testament to Acts 2 and 4, where there's a whole lot about common property, the apostles have a common pool of resources they can all draw on. I think that's to be understood in the context of landed, tribal, territorially defined administrative units. And actually, what's interesting there is that if, and this is again a bit of a speculation on my end, and we'll get to Europe and we'll get to actual European history, but I think that the point that the Bible, the narrative of Scripture is making is that the nations are coming into this assembly in the same way as the tribes come into Israel. So our nations are effectively tribes of the spiritual Israel, which is the church. Obviously, that's the traditional understanding. A bishop is a bishop not for a job, bishop of doctors, bishop of engineers. It's a bishop for territory, for nation, for place. So if you understand Acts in harmony with Numbers and Leviticus, the commons. I think that's what's being gotten at there, you know. And I think Europe, a lot of things in European history, they come about without explicit sort of manifestos behind them. How did we transition the Roman Empire and its economy to what you get in the Middle Ages? It's not very clear, actually. It's quite mysterious. It's as mysterious as the coming about of cathedrals and, you know, a lot of these other things. It just kind of happened. But it's very biblical, actually. The way we organized ourselves, often very biblical, very pagan in another sense, which is that the Romans knew a lot of this stuff too. If you read Plutarch, Parallel Lives, in his chapter on Tiberius Gracchus, he gets into how the reason why Gracchus was so hated, among other reasons actually, by the Senate, is because his agricultural reforms that he proposed were basically blaming the elite for wanting to get the Italian farmer off his land, get him destitute, so that you can bring in slave labor to work that land. You know, replace the local farmer who was landed, who was a yeoman, who had that ethos, get him off, bring in slaves. And he specifically connects that to the war machine, which is why he wanted peace with the Numantines in my country, in Spain. And Cervantes actually picks up on this theme. So I think that the biblical idea that if you lose your connection to collectively owned land as an expression of an identity, a collective identity, tribal, familial, you will lose the land, you will be replaced by the foreign. The foreigner will replace you in your country. Leviticus 25 does talk about that towards the end of the chapter. The foreigner coming to become prominent in your land. So a lot of these things are relevant today for obvious reasons, right? But get me back on track if I've sort of exhausted the question or not really addressed it.
Well, you've opened up so many interesting threads there, Mr. Perona. But one thing that really struck me was those passages from Numbers and Leviticus, which essentially inspire and lay out the law of entail, the customary law of entail. And I think that Marx was essentially right that capitalism is commodification. And so I think this is bringing us later on to early modernity and the beginning of capitalism, agrarian capitalism, prior to industrialization, where you can pinpoint the moment of that transition from feudalism to agrarian capitalism with the end of the estates-based social order. And I think there's actually a specific legal moment, and that's just what I wanted to allude to, when the capitalism takes hold of the land itself and it commodifies it. It gets rid of the custom of entail and puts a fence around it, metaphorically and literally speaking, and assigns a monetary value to it. And it's at that point that there's actually a change in the law where land, which had previously been tied to personal ownership by sovereign rights. So in the Roman law sense, it was actually tied to law as pertaining to people rather than pertaining to a commodity. That actually gets changed, its legal status. And so it can be divided, sold off, and turned into capital. And just as an example, in the case of the Habsburg monarchy, this happened at a stroke when the imperial parliament in Vienna abolished the old property law with the famous Kudlik Gazettes in 1848, ended the estates-based social order in the legal sense. So that's very striking. But if we go back to the origin of the commons, as you say, it's mysterious. And I think if we're talking about mystery and the social order, we're talking about grace, we're talking about the supernatural. I would make the case that as you've alluded to, the Book of Acts there, following the evangelical counsel, the exhortation to live lives of poverty, chastity, and obedience, and to hold all things in common, this being proper to the religious life, with the founding of Europe in many ways by the Benedictine order and the cultivation and growth of communities around Benedictine monasteries, the commons seems to be imitative of the monks sharing things in common. And I think that it wouldn't be a stretch to say that the newly Christianized peasantry and rural population took their example of holding things in common, of common life from those monks.
Yeah, I think in the Spanish case, I've heard the case made for a sort of the Baraudas, who were these odd sort of tribal, mostly Basque probably, but Romanized, unhappy with the Visigoths and them sort of originating the commons in their areas. But even there, oftentimes it's the monastic life that's at the center of these communities. And that's a bit of a historically spurious account that I just mentioned. But it's funny that even in accounts where something like a martial context is credited for the invention of the commons in parts of my country, Spain, it's the alliance with a monastic order or monastic life that's often brought up. In Spain, why do I mention the martial context? Because, later on in histories of the Reconquista, you get the idea that those who get the right to populate middle and southern parts of the country as the Reconquista advances are going to constitute themselves as free men who have access to the land that they gain. So el comunal, the commons, in that context, is often a creature of military conquest. But of course, these are deeply devout people. Devout people in the sense in which a medieval person was devout. We might not maybe have a clearer understanding now. I mean, obviously this was a very creative group of people, and there was odd engravings in Romanesque churches that are often grotesque. Okay, wonderful, but they are devout. And I agree that the monastic experience is often at the heart of a lot of that. So I think that's very plausible that there's an imitation of the monastic. I wonder if it's just an imitation of the monastic, or if it's also a sense of relief, because as the Roman Empire is changing, and as the critique that Saint Augustine had articulated about the Roman Empire, right, the libido dominandi, the desire to dominate, as that is sort of put into focus as not legitimate, as actually a deviation, that true discipline doesn't come by way of domination, it comes by way of shared manual labor, this ideal of sharing the labor that has to get done rather than dominating the one who will do it for you. This must have been very appealing in the Roman era. I mean, our opponents or our ideological critics will often point to Christianity as a kind of proto-communism, as having these kind of revolutionary elements in it. And that's true, but the direction in which it's moving is what's important. I think that Christianity does transform the Roman Empire. It does subvert the Roman Empire, but it subverts it in a way that leads to human flourishing and that takes discipline in a different direction. So yeah, I don't know anything about the history of the origin of the commons, but that seems very plausible. Yeah, that it was a monastic imitation by lay persons. Sure.
Well, the medieval world was such a tapestry of diverse organic settlements that we're picking out here common patterns. But as you say, because it emerged in such an organic way, not in a designed, contrived way that you see in modernity, I think the important thing is just to recognize that these arrangements, they differed, and it might be quite useful just to mention here an example Simon Fairley gives of a system referring to the observations that Daniel Defoe makes. So in the 17th century, in a Somerset town called Cheddar, but elements of it can be found throughout Europe. So he observed villages where dairy was the main form of agriculture, and he watched these peasants, and he saw that their system had elements of both private and public or social economic activity. So it was private in such as the cows were owned and lodged by individual families who milked them in the morning and provided whatever particular care they needed. There was no economy of scale to be derived from milking centrally, and the milk was accessible to the consumers, to the families, fresh from the cows, providing a substantial economy of distribution. Each family would also get its own share of the manure. But then it would switch to social management of that property when, at an appointed time in the morning, a cow herd would pass through the village and the cows would file out to make their way to the common pasture. And here the economy of scale advantage was gained from grazing all the cows together. Then in the evening, the herd would return to the village and the cows would peel off once more to their individual sheds, where they're again milked by the families. Their owners would calibrate the amount of extra feed the cows would need given the amount of milk they require. It would switch back to social management when any milk surplus to domestic requirements was taken to the common creamery and made into cheese, another process which benefits from economies of scale. And in this village, families were paid with entire cheeses weighing 100 weight or more, which they would consume or market as they saw fit. So this system that Defoe observed, this elegant system, wasn't subservient to any form of ideology. It evolved from a kind of dialogue between private interest and common sense. I thought that was quite a good illustration.
Yeah. So in terms of the ethos of the people that originate that kind of arrangement or that inhabit that kind of arrangement, I think, a lot of the question of how something comes about has to have to do with the psychology of the people in whose midst it comes about. And so because we now are saddled with a very specific kind of political economy and certain anthropological assumptions about how people interact economically as economic agents, we maybe don't understand why people are comfortable pooling together when it's necessary, as you said, when economies of scale make sense, and disaggregating the rest of the time. I think because you started off the conversation talking about a dichotomy in modernity, right, between public and private ownership, and the commons are somewhere in between, we can more or less ascribe a psychology to the two extremes that the commons mediates between. So anthropology has tended to tell us incorrectly that, well, by anthropology, I don't mean modern anthropologists. I mean the kind of speculations that were sort of just so stories that then led into social contract theory. Okay, individuals want to maximize their interests, and Enlightenment reason ends up getting identified with the calculative faculty, which is identified with monetary yield, because if you put a price tag on every activity, you can more or less determine if this activity is better than that activity, right? Because it has a number. You can calculate the value of activities. Is it going to lead to monetary yield or not? Great. And then at the farther reaches, you get the von Mises types who say, well, this is really the linguistic faculty. The human being who develops this is a political agent. Prior to that, he has no rights. You can sell a child, you can abort a child. This is basic. This is consubstantial to that kind of mentality. I think Simone Weil was right to say no. We actually, she's a Jewish convert to Catholicism. There's another Simone Weil who was a pro-abortion activist, completely different person, obviously. Simone Weil, in Need for Roots, she talks about how at every level of identity, we tend to project that identity into some kind of a spatial extent. We kind of need to ground my identity as a family, my identity as a neighborhood, as a village, in some resource that is managed together. Because I experience my belonging to something, or I experience myself not as individual, but as a Johnson, as a member of the village, as an Englishman, by participating in the resources that are owned by that corporate identity. So I think that right off the bat, I think that the point is that the people that would originate the commons would have some ecstatic sense of themselves, by which I mean exiting the individual, the skin encased individual, and experiencing themselves as a community. That's very obvious. It's not actually a big deal, but it becomes so when, when we, as I said, when we get saddled with political theories that seem to deny the obvious. So that's part of it. And then the other part of it is what is cultivated in me when I participate in a certain arrangement, right? Okay, this psychology originates it, and this psychology is cultivated by it. And I think that that's the deliberative faculty of managing resources together, of coming together and deciding how we're going to manage a resource, which is an education, it's pedagogical, it's a laboratory, it's the place where you learn proper sociability. In again, I'll draw on Spain, my country. If it used to be the case that if something needed to get done, for example, with respect to the commons, so there was a walkway that was overgrown or common mill had fallen into disrepair, you would ring the bell, the church, almost always rural 11th century Romanesque style church, and then people would send a representative from each household, and you would kind of decide. That was an open council, that kind of the subject that finds himself at home in that and that's able to express himself and come together with others and manage the day to day, I think is a stronger subject than the one who is divorced from those sorts of things and only interacts with others in maybe a more anodyne way. I mean, the modern office is very different because you're not coming together to administer a common resource that you then will get direct benefit from. It's very different actually. So you become far more passive outside of the regular communal management of a common resource pool. Probably what happened is that we've weakened as people, and we can talk about the agricultural revolution, the industrial revolution, the context in which we ended up moving into cities. Probably is a context which Ortega said, the Spanish thinker, who talks about the mass man proliferating in the 19th century, he's probably right. He's probably right. There probably is a weakening of the average subject to some degree, at least in that sense, Yeah, we'll stop there and we can take it in whatever direction.
Well, that was fascinating, and I'm particularly interested there what you said about how the practice and the life of managing resources and land in common has an effect on the psychology of the family and the households, the persons that inhabit a particular community. Mark Barnes, who has been on this program, once said that the commons, he described the commons as a kind of quasi sacrament, in that a quasi sacrament of the community, of a village, in that it both symbolizes and enacts the reality of the communion of the society. So as you say, it really matters that you get on with your neighbor and that you cooperate in repairing the fence, managing the pond in the village together, because you rely on that for supplementary forms of protein which are necessary for your family. And so those thicker communal relationships are established because of the need for the other in managing this common resource. And this is where the criticism of the commons that grew up in the wake of the Protestant Revolution and the beginning of capitalism depended on this, as you've already alluded to, this sort of Hobbesian anthropology, this struggle of all against all, which overlooks, as E.P. Thompson says, the fact that commoners are not without, or were not without, common sense.
Yeah. So, and it was a political project. I mean, the point there, in part, there's a material sort of obvious economic advantage to moving people into cities and creating a large proletariat and having an industrial base that can export and all the rest of it. And that's probably why the Parliamentary Enclosure Acts in the case of the UK happened when they happened. I think 73 is the main 1773, the Enclosure Act, but there's several during the 1750s. 1773 would be, I think, when the commoner is really restricted from having access to certain communal lands. In Spain, we have it round about the same time in 1798. We call it the desamortización, and it's also when church land is seized. But the point is to create a bourgeoisie, and the point is to create a proletariat, at least to some degree. So there's an obvious reason. Unfortunately for Edmund Burke, the point is also psychological, and he kind of says at one point in Reflections on the French Revolution that if you have a lot of concentration of land, it creates a certain sense of awe, certain sense of authority. I don't remember the language that he uses specifically, but he links it to the idea of submitting to order and having a wholesome sense, a healthy sense of authority above you, to be sort of faced with these large landed aristocrats or owners or whatever it is, right? So for him, perhaps there was some more psychologizing reason for not really critiquing the enclosures. In terms of the politics of it, then, which have a second part, they have a second act, which is very recent, even in Europe. We can sort of get into what the common agricultural policy de facto does to small farms, and this thing has been going on for a while. But before we get to that, because the political question is important, there's a sort of pre-political or quasi-political element here, which is just communitarian. It's just the sense of identification with a community and feeling connected. The only woman who's won the Nobel Prize, if that matters, Eleanor Ostrom, made her research about the commons, and she wrote a book called Governing the Commons. So what she found was that there is no tragedy of the commons, not necessarily. If certain design principles are observed, commons are very sustainable, generation to generation. But one of the design principles that has to be observed is a strong in-group, out-group distinction. You have to know who gets to have a say in decision-making with respect to your common pool, and you have to know who's an outsider, who doesn't get to have a say in how they're managed, or in taking a piece out of them. And you have to have systems for integrating newcomers, obviously. You have to have criteria for integrating newcomers. That's wonderful. You have to sometimes integrate a newcomer, but you have to have some semi-porous membrane around this community. So she kind of sets it up as a game theory thing where you want to reach collaborative equilibrium, and you have the incentives for defecting, which is when people just take too much out to benefit themselves and end up depleting the common pool of resources, the fish in the river, whatever it happens to be. But she says, the institutional incentives for not defecting are often social goods. They're often, no, I don't want to. I don't want to hurt my neighbor in the long run or myself. And I also feel as though there's a taboo against doing that kind of thing. We maybe and it's not directly related to the commons, but when you were speaking, it came up in my mind. We might be able to turn to how the policy of some states tried to change the psychology of their subjects, especially in the context of sort of overseas conquest. So the example that I liked, because it's very clear, but I'm sure there are a lot of others, is Madagascar. Apparently, at the very end of the 19th century, in 1896, I think, Joseph Gallieni came in as governor of Madagascar, and he imposed a head tax. And if you read the justifications for putting a head tax on locals, part of it has to do with this idea that they are pre-rational, they're pre-modern, and they spend a lot of time on socially embedded games of prestige, right? I mean, the way that I make art, the way that I show off my conch necklace, the way that I always give you a little more than I owe you, and you always give me a little more than you owe me, and we remain in this kind of cycle of socially embedded exchange. It's not precise exchange. It's not one for one. I don't go to dinner at your house and invite you to dinner to my house the very next day and serve you exactly the same thing, because then you would get the idea, oh, you don't really want to have a ongoing friendship, obviously, because you want to be done with this. I'm a debt to you. They do that. They're not exact. So what we need to do is we need to put a head tax on them. They have to pay a certain amount of money. They don't have any money. So they're going to have to get that money from the French soldiers stationed in Madagascar, meaning they're going to have to learn services, make goods that are useful to us. And now they're going to think economically. They're going to think in terms of exact exchange because we've given them a number. They have to get a certain number. That's the tax. Now they're rational. We're elevating them above this social chaos of tribal whatever and putting them in modernity. And I wonder whether that kind of rhetoric doesn't have something to do with the sort of psychological transition that is affected when you get rid of common land and when you make every individual an individual. You own things for yourself and for your family, okay, but the family becomes more and more atomic, right? As modernity presses on and we become these kind of tiny little families and divorced from we don't know our cousins, we live in different cities, all this kind of stuff, right? So there is probably something to that. And there is probably something to it also because we have the pro-enclosure propaganda of the 1700s, 1800s, late 1700s. We have examples of people arguing that if you let even the worker who's already moved to the city move back to the countryside and buy a plot of land, he's going to be happy and he's not going to work. As soon as he gets enough money to leave, get himself a nice little arable stretch, that's it. Industry will collapse. So you have to put limits on that, on the worker's ability to regress. So we know that it was a deliberate political project, right? The difference between the commons coming about, as you said, in an almost Eucharistic, we don't know how. We experienced it. This other development isn't like that. It's quite deliberate. We have all the breadcrumbs that we need to sort of understand it as a rational project.
Yeah, all the literature's there to evidence that. And would you say that project first is realized in England?
Yeah, probably. Probably because even though, as I see, I guess the British agricultural revolution starts before 1700, probably it starts in the 17th century and it rolls on until the 19th century. I suppose the four crop rotation, which is in itself good because it gives the peasant, the farmer, a lot more free time, capture more nitrogen, right? Turnips capture nitrogen. Probably the free time that the peasant now has is immediately seized upon, and the enclosure acts start sort of quickly thereafter. I wonder what the causation was. I wonder whether people started seeing, we don't need the farmer to be over there. Look at the yields that we're getting by planting, turnips, and the fields don't have to be fallow for as long as they used to. We could probably get these guys to move into cities and to maybe it was sort of the agricultural revolution happens. You start to get a lot more feed for animals, and people start to think, policymakers start to think, okay, maybe it makes sense for all these idle farmers to do something else. Did it start in Britain? I think so. I don't know, but in Spain, I'll tell you that we have some antecedents of the enclosures with Charles III, and he stops reigning, I think, in 1788. And then it's 1790 something at the very end, where you have the Desamortización de Godoy. So it's a little bit later. And probably it doesn't happen as rapidly because we have a massive urbanization way later on in the 20th century, where really people start moving into the cities. So it is likely that we got there a little late, and Spain has always been late with respect to the processes that affect the rest of Europe. So just judging from that, and without necessarily knowing the history of other European countries on this kind of thing, I assume that, as Blake said, everything starts on Albion's Druid shore, something like that, and probably this did as well. You had enclosures before. But we talked about this. I don't know if we were recording already. You had enclosures already in the 1200s. There were attempts at it, but the monarch would typically say, "Hey, I don't want the landlord strengthening himself against the peasant, but ultimately against me." So that was resisted, and then there were rebellions. You had in the history of England all these sort of there were a few rebellions against enclosure, um, by villagers, by rural people. There's a few examples of that. Um, I don't know whether the massive explosion in population that Britain experienced during the Industrial Revolution was experienced at the same time as early everywhere else. Because my understanding is that between 1750 and 1850, England goes like from 5 million to 16 something million. It's, more than triples the population. So the agricultural revolution creates this massive surplus population that can now work in the cities. Probably that's earlier. And the same thing happens elsewhere, but I assume that's earlier than on the continent. And then the sort of irony there is that we have this explosion. Everybody goes to the city. Now we have a strong export sector from industry. And that's exactly what's going to end up depleting the population. Actually, city population has lower fertility. Sort of we go up and we go down, right? So there's this weird mirroring process in history where we have the intuition that if we go back to the commons now, it would help us with our fertility. It would help us with this demographic sinkhole that we've become, in Europe. Because maybe, that is the shape of history. Maybe that is the shape of history. There's evidence here in Italy that the city takes on all this population, the empire collapses, the rural people, their population was always higher, and then they end up coming back and replacing the urbanite with the lower fertility. So this might actually be a recurring um, pattern.
So the landscape of Europe, we have to envisage, looked very different in medieval Christendom with the open field system, with strip farming. The hedges, the so beloved of my own landscape, my own country's landscape, were not so prominent at this time. And I think with English enclosures, you have multiple waves, two prominent waves. The first is the period of Tudor enclosures, which leads to the first and most well-known denunciation of them by St. Thomas More in Utopia, where he says, "Your sheep that were wont to be so meek and tame and so small eaters, now, as I hear say, be become so great devourers and so wild, and they eat up and swallow down the very men themselves. They consume, destroy, and devour whole fields, houses, and cities. Nobleman and gentleman, yea, and certain abbots, leave no ground for tillage. They enclose all into pastures. They throw down houses, they pluck down towns, and leave nothing standing, but only the church to be made a sheep house." End quote. So it was a very prominent concern early on in the Tudor period. Now, I would argue that the reason that this goes from becoming an active grievance among rural populations to something that becomes systematic and you can see as really a social problem with the passing of the Elizabethan Poor Laws for the first time is because of the Protestant Reformation, namely that a fish rots from its head. So the nobility in enclosing the commons followed what their liege lord, the king, had done. He dispossessed the church, dissolved the monasteries. They proceeded to dispossess the commoners. And I think that sanction, that sort of implicit sanction, is perhaps why England is at the vanguard here of this vast great reset, this dispossession. It becomes accelerated, as you say, in the period of parliamentary enclosures in the 18th century, when it's given that full legal impetus behind it. It's interesting to note, as you say, that various kings, and Charles I actually is the most outstanding example, did their best as the father of the fathers of the realm to put a check on this process, to frustrate it as much as possible. The number of anti-enclosure commissions set up by Charles I was the greatest of any of these monarchs, and he's been called the one English monarch of outstanding importance as an agrarian reformer. You mentioned Edmund Burke, and one of the stunning insights from your essay on Edmund Burke and the Commons follows that point that you just made about how he has this sense that property should be an aristocratic institution, one admired, one viewed from a distance, but not one participated in on a popular level, it would seem. And you write, it is worth considering the degree to which this species of conservatism is of a piece with a kind of scholastic theological loss of the participative metaphysics and experiential spirituality we find in the work of, for example, Pseudo Dionysius. I mean, that was just such a illuminating insight.
Thank you. Well, it has a lot to do with what you said, right? I mean, this idea that a fish rots from the head and that the Protestant Reformation might have led to the enclosures. Yeah, I wonder whether ideas matter and ideas sort of have this lead up. But let's try to dig into the Neoplatonic and the Dionysian metaphysics of Christianity proper, participative metaphysics of real Christianity. So, if I have an element in the world that is a manifestation of some portion of man, because nature, because animal nature, mineral nature, everything around us to some degree has to be manifesting the purpose of Adam, the reason why this king of creation, the human frame, and then the second Adam, the coming of Christ. What its telos is has to be visible in nature. So when you have land and when you have animals and when you have the management of resources, what you have are aspects of the human psyche. You don't get to turn property arbitrarily into a kind of static image that then renders the member of a political community a kind of, let's say, a non-participative dead letter in that community. What Dionysius the Areopagite does is he really takes, as I read him, he takes God the Father as basically the one in the prologue of John, το Theon, not Theos, the Logos, το Theon, the one in το hen of the Neoplatonists, similar concept because he's non-participated. The participatable is that Logos, and then we are the participators. We participate in that intermediary, in the Logos. So you experience yourself by having an active role to play in that which is right above you. I think there is a political implication there, but there's also just a psychological implication that you can't really know things by observing them without touching, without understanding their dynamic, without interacting with them. To know the natural world, to know your own faculties of deliberation and of sociability, you have to exercise them. You can't know them abstractly. You can't understand what they are without unpacking them. Unpacking them is a physical act in a certain sense. I have to interact with you to understand myself as a creature that can interact. And the same goes, therefore, for political life. I can't understand why I exist in community with others unless I'm participating in some kind of grounded stratum that represents our meeting place, the field that we all use, or whatever it is. I'm not picking on Thomas there, and it was a while. It's been a while since I've sort of spent time with Saint Thomas. I don't think that the Thomists that I'm alluding to are doing justice to him necessarily. what I think is that there's been this kind of, let's say, pura natura, two-tier Thomism that has become very popular. And because it posits what should be an irrational absurdity, this idea that there could be a nature that in and of itself does not receive grace, will never receive grace, was created for the sake of existing devoid of grace. It's a weird hypothesis. It doesn't make sense. Nature is always created to, at some point, receive grace and then have its own essence revealed in that receiving of grace, because it doesn't subsist on its own. It only subsists because God wills it to subsist. So no, there is no pura natura in that sense. But because you've had a two-tier Thomism that posited such a thing, yeah, I think that in the end we had a sense of the inert of matter, of the potential for a purely inert matter that in and of itself is almost outside of the creative agency, that could potentially be outside of the creative agency. So we don't do justice to nature, and we don't do justice to those parts of ourselves that are low, those parts of ourselves that interact with the material, those parts of ourselves that are merely everyday. And in in detaching those parts of ourselves from grace and not seeing them as sacred, there's nothing there to be cultivated. You don't have to participate in common property. You don't have to participate in the natural world, because in and of itself, there's nothing edifying about that. And I think also there's a sort of stratification here, because maybe the lower rungs of society are imagined to correspond to that potentially devoid of grace, mere residue of nature. Now, I think this kind of operates more psychologically than it does theologically. I don't think that the terms in which I'm defining two-tier Thomism necessarily are explicit anywhere. They might be. They kind of are sometimes. But I think it's more of a psychological perception that that you can have an empty, graceless nature. That's what I was getting at there. It's been a while since I was in Thomas. It's been a while since I read the Celestial Hierarchy. And it would be edifying to go back and sort of see where we can recover Saint Dionysius and do something with him. Maximus the Confessor, Gregory of Nyssa, as well, in these sorts of contexts. I mean, Dionysius sees everything as a potential icon, an image-bearing icon. So while being, radically apophatic, I mean, ultimately the logos is any harmonious configuration of multiplicity can be a logoic image bearer for Dionysus. I'll stop there and you can sort of redirect.
Well, I think our mutual friend, Dr. Sebastian Morello, has written at some length about the importance of recovering the Platonism within the thought of St. Thomas Aquinas. And I think that project is important to be able to, as you say, understand Christian Neoplatonism in this kind of metaphysically divorced paradigm that we find ourselves in.
Yeah, and what does it do to the Trinity? What does it do to the Trinity? Is the Logos then that Proclean intermediary? But sorry, that's actually not related to the comments, but we could. It's an interesting question. Absolutely, yeah. There's a Trinitarianism there that I think is de-emphasized, and I wish that I'd been digging into these guys before this interview, because Saint Dionysius is really great, and I wonder whether when we started questioning the authenticity of the Dionysian corpus, as if it really mattered, and calling him pseudo instead of at least deutero, at least second Dionysus, at least honor him as that. I wonder whether that was a very early breach in our Christian heritage.
Yeah. Yeah, certainly the fractality of reality. This is a term that Andrew Willard Jones has emphasized in understanding the microcosm macrocosm analogy. I think here you're referring to how to be thought of as constituting the lower members of the medieval political corpus were, as you say, sundered from a kind of participation in the contemplative telos of the corpus, which we see there with the fact that the lord of the manor, the king, might have title to an estate, might own it, but we're colouring that with our modern understanding of it. The peasant enjoyed all sorts of so-called usufructuary rights, which enabled him to graze stock, cut wood, peat, draw water, grow crops on these various plots of land. And then through this slow act of violence, this process of the enclosures, he is estranged. Now, as you say, ideologues, the proponents of this process, argue that the open fields, that the commons is highly inefficient. They say that the scattered strips waste time and effort, and that where communal controls are rigidly imposed, they prevent the use of new crops, notably fodder crops such as the turnip, and nitrogen-fixing fallow crops such as clover. The boundaries between strips, where the balks or unploughed strips wasted valuable land and harboured weeds, which inevitably seeded themselves among the growing crops. The paradigm of efficiency and commodification comes to rule. Mark Barnes situates the enclosures with the game laws as well, and the very harsh legal penalties that were enforced again against common peasants supplementing their diet with game. And then the poor laws, which turned people towards a life of tending mechanisms. These structures destroyed what historians call the subsistence economy, in which most of a family's labor went to producing things directly for their own use and consumption. When authorities banned the hunt, privatized the common land on which peasants once raised their crops and animals, and forced a new set of laws that criminalized not being employed, families were cast into a world in which they did not have the means to produce life for themselves. There's the participation. And in which they faced punishment for not doing so. At the behest of the industrialists, the English government effectively created the proletariat, a class of people who had to work for wages, a state medieval Christendom would have classified as poverty alongside the condition of cripples and beggars, end quote. So is that characteristic of the process that we observe in Spain as well?
Yeah. In Spain, the comunal, which still exists to some degree, absolutely, yeah, it gives way to. I mean, we had a disastrous 19th century, probably in part because of this huge destabilizing effect of the late 1700 loss of the commons, as well as of church property. So for us, the political motivation was mimetic. We wanted to imitate countries that were ahead of us at that point. We were entering into a decadence. People will really only feel the loss of the empire at the end of the 18th century, obviously. I mean, of the 19th century. But yeah, when you can't rely on local modes of production, you experience urban poverty, and it's a very ugly thing because there's other, urban poverty is characterized by ways of producing that are very automatic and that are psychologically very alienating. And because cities concentrate masses of people who at that time were just not used to population density like that. I mean, the psychological trauma there must have also played into it because Spain has always been very underpopulated compared to the population density of other countries. So these people were coming into a whole new reality. I think it's you can sort of understand the Marxist idea of alienation from labor more fully, more properly in terms of this alienation from labor and from communal labor and from the spaces in which you encounter your common identity with others. Although, in the cities, you rediscover it to some degree. Neighborhood associations and so forth start to crop up. And I think that there is something that compensates there, for that sustains people. And these were also, for the most part, religious people. So they had a parish. So I don't think that the full monstrous trauma of what's going on is necessarily felt all at once. I think it's a process, and then it has to do with secularization later on. And you continue to see it now, even in the past 20 years, the amount of small farms in Europe has decreased radically. I think we've lost like a third uh, of the farms, not the arable land, not the land that's cultivated, not that, but I mean, there continues to be this massive concentration. So it comes in waves. That's because of the common agricultural policy system of funding by hectare, for example. But it comes in waves. So I think we're still experiencing that. And to some degree, I think that people react to it, but uh, it's interesting to see how political consciousness has sort of omitted something that would have been very intuitive and very obvious. You started off by talking about the commons as a neglected category. How did that happen? It's obvious. Why neglect it? It's hard to think that you can sit down and consider the economic arrangements of this population and not have an account, at least, of the commons, of why they would come about and how they would function. But our political categories neglect it. And I think as a consequence, even when you get farmer revolts, and I think that's beautiful what's happening now, but I mean, that they're not necessarily always articulating the heritage that they should be linking themselves to.
Yeah. And for example, Pope Leo XIII touches on some of those themes of alienation and
Yeah.
refounding solidarity in
Rerum Novarum.
Rerum Novarum, exactly, and the importance of Catholic trade unions, basically, and forms of voluntary association. I don't know if he touches on the commons explicitly, and I wonder if that was an oversight, perhaps, of the 19th century popes. I mean, I know there is a lot of writing and many comments by the popes, allocutions about rural life and about the value of agricultural economies, agricultural orders, but I haven't come across anything specifically on the commons. I don't know if you.
No, I don't think he does. I might be wrong. I don't think he does in Rerum Novarum. I also have always wondered why priests in Spain didn't, because they lost a lot of church property was lost at the same time as the commons. If it was the same legal act that dissolved large swaths of both. So I don't know. That's a very good question. Although, the idea of the open council and the village council and a lot of this stuff, it is appealed to romantically at times, even in the context of regional peripheric nationalism in Spain, which has its own reasons for coming about out of as a pseudomorph of Carlism. Actually, it starts off as reactionary Carlism, and then it evolves into a hyper modern, imitate the French type of mythology. But it does appeal romantically in its rhetoric, and that's sort of it. Uh, so it's an interesting question. I mean, if we want to talk about how there's a metaphysical reason why you don't feel as though the lower strata of society or the mineral or earthy part of your surroundings belong to you and are actually a manifestation of you, and you should be involved in them and you should find grace in them and they should be brought up into the liturgy with you. If you don't feel that, or that your metaphysics hides that, then perhaps the issue of the commons and the legacy of the commons just doesn't loom as large when you look back at history. Maybe there's something there. Maybe these realities are so obvious that they become invisible.
Mm.
Maybe that's what happened. I don't know. I mean, I think now we have, and a lot of this is speculative for your audience to know. A lot of it is speculative because we don't know. I mean, the history of it, the definitive history of the commons, that would be great if somebody really dug in and researched it, but that hasn't been done.
Mm.
So absolutely, yeah, yeah. If you talk about the Catholic tradition, Chesterton does, I think in his essay where he responds to Bernard Shaw, I think he talks about the commons. So distributism, which is always sort of there, does, but there's no encyclicals, I don't think, that address it, unfortunately. I wonder whether things have to get really bad or a certain development has to bear its full bloody grotesque fruit before you can kind of see it for what it is, and then the chaff and the wheat, well, they have to grow up together and then you can separate them. You can't do it prematurely. So I wonder whether that's the point, because we are now at a stage where we're so alienated from the physical base of labor, of property. A lot of labor is virtual. We live sort of chest up a lot of the time. The rest of the body becomes very sort of mechanical. So I wonder whether now is maybe the time at which you're seeing interest in the commons, because there's a sense that, well, hold on now, we've lost something here. I mean, the work of Eleanor Ostrom is interesting for that reason, right? I mean, she goes around the world, she looks at the commons, and she says, hey, there is no tragedy. They are sustainable. You just have to do certain things. And to her credit, she seems to be on solid empirical footing. Her research seems good. So I mean, maybe that interest comes in at that stage. Here's another interesting guy who talks about the commons incorrectly. The ex-finance minister for Greece, for Syriza, Varoufakis.
Okay.
In his book, yeah, he wrote a book, Techno-Feudalism, where he talks about the cloud, Amazon, etc. And he describes what big tech has done to the internet as a new enclosure. So
Mm.
he says, what these guys have done, HTTP colon backslash, that's the commons. That's for everybody. But they've kind of occupied so much of the internet, and so many online activities go through them that they exact a rent from all these activities when you buy through Amazon, etc. He has a point. But what he's looking at as commons is international. It's every human being on the planet should have access to this, to basic pieces of code or to whatever it is online. So he's not understanding the commons as delineated by a community, as a particular organ within the body of the human ecumen. No, it's international. It's for everybody. The enclosures are bad. That's globalism. The commons are good, but that's internationalism. So there's nothing between the individual and absolute universal everybody. Nothing. No mediating logos. No organs in the body of Christ. Just miasma and cell. That's it, right? So this would be actually the mirror image of the von Mises type thing of, oh, no, it's just you as a linguistically endowed calculating agent. That's it. That's it. What other identities can you experience? You're telling me you have a personhood with your wife? Your children are part of an extended personhood? Ridiculous, right? But that's the Catholic image, this body. We're a body. We're not a blob. We have organs. The body of Christ has organs in it. Wow. But that means they have to have physical stratum. They have to have a sustaining physical presence in the real world at each level, which can be the land of the farmer, and it can be the physical infrastructure that each identity indexes itself to, if that makes sense. It reflects itself upon and it participates in this body. So we're due for a recovery of that. I think that the empirical work is weirdly done in the sense that Ostrom got a lot right, and her design principles, I don't know. I'm not a social scientist. I wasn't involved, but they seem very sound, remarkably conservative for people who happen to not be conservative a priori. They're remarkably conservative. So that work has been done, and the metaphysics of it maybe are not as obscure as perhaps I'm making it sound, or in our sort of speculative way, we're trying to grope for what the metaphysics of the commons would be. But I think that's actually quite clear as well. That's part of the Christian legacy as well. So I think we're maybe due for a recovery. Specifically, it would be wonderful in the context of these, galvanizing changes that Europe is going through now, the farmer revolts and all the rest of it.
Yeah. Well, the way that you conclude your essays in advocating for a self-managed commons, an updated commons, evenly, a politically empowered commons, intelligently integrating modern technology, you write, as the centerpiece of any conservative project worthy of the name, end quote. I believe that the recovery of a Christian political order requires the recovery of Christian economic orders. And the extent to which a grassroots effort is really required here. Do you have any sort of further thoughts about how we recover, as you put it, the satisfaction of building things together?
Yeah, I mean, okay. So because I live on the continent and I've worked with European funds for a long time. So the degree to which we're alienating rural people through policy provides a good opportunity for some of this stuff. That's maybe not so interesting, but the farm to fork policy and the trying to get people that we may depend on chemical fertilizer, nitrogen, atmospheric nitrogen, that's sort of heated at a high temperature, to now transition back to organic fertilizers after we've basically ruined their yields. What do we expect? Of course, they're going to rebel. The fact that we fund per hectare has massively reduced independent farms. Of course, they're going to rebel. So then what do we do there? I think there's a few things we can do. Obviously, you can always buy land in common and start to organize your community on that basis. We were always free to do that. Our purchasing power has been eroded, but we were always free to do that. I think we have to think of ourselves as more free than we are, than we have been, because those possibilities are there. In Spain, there's been an initiative which has sort of a buffet of pro bono lawyers available to look at property that is treated as governmental, municipal, perhaps, and investigate it and say, hey, this is not government property. This actually has there's no documentation that this belongs to the government. This is commons. This park, this walkway, this forest. It doesn't belong to the government. The government just acts as though it belongs to them, or as though they can sell it or rent it. Okay, that's an interesting initiative. I think where we can really make something interesting is perhaps sort of adapting the concept of the commons to modern technology, is by looking a lot of these open source and artificial intelligence platforms and indigenizing them and making them appropriate to a wholesome local identity. For example, Stability, which is a AI company, it has one of its image generating softwares is called Stable Diffusion. You can strip that down. It's open source, and add only cultural references that are relevant to you. You'll never get Miley Cyrus. You'll never get Jennifer Lopez. You won't get any of that stuff. You can make it local. You can use it in schools. You can turn a lot of these technologies, strip them down, and make them reflect your cultural values. That's probably a good place to start. That's not, don't reject them, use them. Why not? There's a lot to be done there. But actual land acquisition and structuring communities around that, and actual sort of open councils and local councils, I think we never really lost it. I think we have it there. I think to some degree, when you interact with your neighbors, you could sort of shepherd them and yourself into more edifying interactions in which you talk about how to manage this walkway or whatever it happens to be. I don't know. I mean, I live in a country where I don't speak the language yet. So, you know, you have to work at it. And as for the, practical path to acquiring resources directly, I think that since what we're seeing now is a kind of revolt of the internal proletariat in Europe, Toynbee's phrase, they're angry, your purchasing power is being eroded, we want to rebel. Introduce it. We could make it part of the ethos of that kind of revolutionary moment that you're seeing there. And maybe practical solutions come out of that. Yeah.
Yeah, certainly opportunities. Mr. Perona Calvete, it's been a fascinating discussion. I will insert links to your work below the video here. I look forward to more of your writing on this topic. So I'm just going to close then with a poem from the 18th century. It was written as a protest against the Enclosure Acts. They hang the man and flog the woman who steals the goose from off the common, yet let the greater villain loose that steals the common from the goose. The law demands that we atone when we take things we do not own, but leaves the lords and ladies fine who takes things that are yours and mine. The poor and wretched don't escape if they conspire the law to break. This must be so, but they endure, those who conspire to make the law. The law locks up the man or woman who steals the goose from off the common, and geese will still a common lack till they go and steal it back. Mr. Perona Calvete, Viva Cristo Rey. Thank you for joining me.
Viva Cristo Rey.